think we're live. Yeah, awesome. So this is gonna be a recording of my um talk on AI regulation around the world, explained with maps and data. I presented this talk a few weeks ago at South by Southwest Sydney, and that was an in-person event, and it was a paid event as well. So um people attended the talk and they loved it, and I made a post about it on LinkedIn, and people requested a follow-up talk to recap on my presentation. So this is where this live stream is at. So I don't think this will take too long, probably around 10-15 minutes, and then probably end it there. This is mainly just going to be a recording for myself, but if questions happen to pop through for the live stream, I'll also just answer them on the spot. So, for those who don't know me, my name is Ray, and I'm a tech lawyer and also a developer. And I have probably one of the most niche hobbies in the world, which is I like to track AI regulation. And how this all came about is, being a tech lawyer and a programmer, AI regulations like the perfect crossover between those two interests. And it started, I'd say, you know, I started liking programs and robots ever since I was a kid. I've been building my own games during high school, and during uni, I was also um, building my own apps and websites. So coding has always been a lifelong hobby, and AI was naturally part of that. I've actually took an interest in AI actually since I'd say first year uni, so around 2016, and that was really around the time where self-driving cars were really the key face of AI. And I was really interested in just following all the developments in these self-driving cars, and that's where I also fell into the rabbit hole of AI ethics. So the very famous trolley problem, which is where if a car was speeding on the road and it can't stop, and in front of it is either like an elderly person or school children, and can only hit one of them, which one should the car hit from an ethical standpoint? And stuff like that got me really interested in the whole idea of like what is right, what is wrong from an AI standpoint. And AI ethics naturally leads to AI regulation. And it's such a back then such a esoteric concept. I think that it was around 2019 where European Union first started proposing the idea of the EA Act, and the whole idea of an AI law I've never thought that would be a thing that will never exist. But as I started reading, I started taking a lot of notes in my notebook, and it got to a point where after I basically hobby writing, just writing my thoughts around AI ethics and regulation. Got to a point where my diary started filling out with notes, and I started posting content on LinkedIn. So this is around 2020, 2021, where, right out of lockdown or during lockdown, where a lot of things were happening in the AI regulatory space. I was posting summaries of developments around the world, including not just Australia, but everywhere, particularly Asia, because I think many people were quite interested in just regulations in Asia generally. And then it got to a point where I had all these separate LinkedIn posts, and I thought, why not I just create a website where it allows, that basically collates all my LinkedIn posts in one spot. And that's where you probably guys follow me for this reason, which is where the global AI regulation tracker came in. I built this in 2023, so this is its second year of operation, where I basically create a world map where you click on a country and it shows you my LinkedIn posts for that particular country. And I thought, why stop there? I should also, do a proper summary, have proper links about that country. So I wanted to make this website kind of like the Wikipedia of AI regulations around the world. And so here's all my LinkedIn posts just gathered in one spot for Australia, and I've done the same for pretty much all the countries here. So that's how I got into AR regulation. Really just started as like a read hobby, and it became a website, and then You know, after ChatGPT blew off and everyone started talking about I happen to be uh, one of the very few lucky people in the world to have had a head start in this area. And yeah, and then that's how um, my LinkedIn came about and all that. So yeah, I'll just get straight into it. What's really about the purpose of my talk? So, AI regulation can get very sort of dry and boring. So I wanted to make this sort of fun and interesting for everyone. And I thought, I'll explain it through data, like maps and data. Because I feel like a lot of laws, if you try to explain them through statutes and text and bills, it can get very dry and so much it's an information overload. So I thought we'll keep it simple. We'll try um, look at some patterns and some graphs that have come out from the data that I've accumulated in my tracker. And so I already talked about the tracker. I'm basically going to talk about three key trends, and these trends are based on this feature here. So you might have seen this insights dashboard feature where I've basically created some dynamic infographics or graphs based on the data, and I'll basically just be going through these graphs one by one. So, and in case my screen gets laggy, I've everything recorded up on this PowerPoint slide. So hopefully things don't get too laggy. I'm not sure if I'm blurring out or anything, but all right, let's just start. So first of all, the first trend I've noticed is that horizontal AI law is intuitive and trendy, but the world is pivoting. Now that's a huge word jargon. So what do I really mean by that? So horizontal AI law is one of the various approaches to AI regulation. Actually, the whole idea of regulating AI, uh, there's no yet a universal consensus of how that should be done. And this chart here basically outlines the various approaches that I've seen so far. And I thought I'll simplify it really into four key categories. So one is your countries that do not yet have any AI specific regulation. So they're mostly relying on voluntary self regulation. So it could be ethical frameworks, it could be voluntary codes and guidelines, etc. And I'll talk about these countries a bit later. The second category is a vertical style form of AI regulation, which is this particular country regulates a specific domain or application of AI on a case by case basis. And here we see notably US, China, and Russia in this category. So the big three are in this category. The third approach, which is horizontal AI law, and that is basically where you have one statute or one act that regulates the entire AI industry as a whole. And this is also a very popular approach. And the last one is basically an extension of the third category, which is enforced horizontal AI law, which is where the actual law is actually enforced rather than being in proposed bill or draft form. So really, actually, two and three, like these two are kind of like the same. It's just a matter of like bindingness. So it's really just three categories. Now, going back to my first point, horizontal AI law is intuitive and trendy. You can see here that this category has the most countries in it. That's because when the concept of AI regulation first came out, let's say during 2019 and 2020, obviously the most intuitive idea is that we just have a law called AI law that regulates AI. That's the most intuitive approach. And often the most common mechanism in that approach is something called the risk-based approach, which is the more risky an AI system, the more strict the regulation we need to have around the AI system. So, for example, there's a different. So, for example, facial recognition technology. You can use the same technology can be used in, let's say, an Instagram or Snapchat filter, but also in, let's say, a system that tracks people on the streets or that can try to detect a suspect in a crime scene. So same use of facial recognition technology, but definitely two very different use cases. And the former use case is definitely way lower risk than the higher use case. So that's why it doesn't really make sense to sort of try to regulate AI at its core. You have to rely on regulating the use case, and to effectively regulate any number of use cases of any character, you try to regulate them by the risk rather than the nature of the use case. So hence why we call it the risk-based approach. And really the poster child of this approach is the European Union with the EU AI Act. I think I have a slide somewhere here. Oh, no, I don't. Okay, so I'm not gonna go over the EU AI Act, but it's basically the world's first, enforced comprehensive act on AI, and it has several distinct categories of obligations. So the first one is your prohibited systems, which are AI systems that pose unacceptable risk to society, and these include, your social creating systems or AI that are used for emotional manipulation, or also biometric identification systems, which there is a certain carve out for that, but in most cases these will be banned in the EU. And then the second category of obligations is called the high risk obligations. So any AI system, for example, used in certain sectors like health, employment, law and justice, and critical infrastructure, anything where if it goes wrong, it can really hurt people. Higher risk, there are very strict quality and risk management obligations attached to it. For those who are in the governance space, the ISO standards are basically kind of like codified into the EA Act for those high risk obligations. And you have another category called these transparency obligations. So, for example, mandatory disclosures and labeling for any AI system that directly interacts with a human being, but it's not obvious that's an AI interacting, or AI that generates synthetic content. So that's where your deep fakes will come in. And you also have a separate category of obligations for general purpose AI models, which is basically your fancy word for foundation models. So really large language models or any sort of a base model, they're also captured under the AI Act. So that structure has been actually inspired a lot of derivative approaches, particularly in South America and in Canada, also in Taiwan, Turkey, Thailand, Vietnam, Malaysia. So a lot of countries are adopting the risk-based approach, but that does not mean every country is actually following the EU AI Act model to the teeth. So to really clarify, the EU AI Act is an example of the risk-based approach, but it is not the only and is not the most accepted example of the risk-based approach. And actually this graph probably best illustrates these sort of what people like to call the EU AI Act copycats. I disagree with the term copycat because they're not actually copying the EU AI Act. They may follow the risk-based approach, but definitely not to the teeth of the European model. And I think this chart is pretty self-explanatory. I think it's, for me, how I like to visualize it is I put them on a scale of 0 to 1, where 1 represents substantial match, where this act is basically, you can basically call it a substantial copy of the EA Act, and then you sort of reduce it down by factors of 0.5, where 0.75% match means it also follows the prohibited practices as well as the other categories to the left, and vice versa. And you can see here, the closest example I've seen is the Brazil, Turkey, Chile, and the Canadian and the act in Peru. The Canadian one was lapsed since last year, but we had some close examples, but they're not up to the real substantial match. The big, I guess, missing gap is that these acts don't propose to regulate general purpose AI models. So they don't propose to regulate foundation models in the same way as how the EA Act has done. At most, they propose, mandatory transparency, such as model/system cards for these foundation models. What we still see a lot is that a lot of coverage in the risk-based obligations. So the higher risk-based obligations, that has been adopted a lot by other countries, as well as the transparency labeling measures, and also all of them have a set of ethic principles at this stage. So At this point in the world, um, AI ethics is not that contentious now compared to, let's say, a few years ago. I think there is quite a universal consensus that it's important to have some ethical principles around AI. Now, what exactly are those ethical principles? There's still some contention, but it's generally around the ideas of accountability, human in the loop, respect privacy, respect IP, and all that. And it's really just a matter of how you then concretize these ethic principles into your legislation. Yeah. So that's the sort of the first trend. And the world is pivoting. So this part really is talking about this other categories here where we see really the weight, the real AI superpowers being US and China not going into the horizontal AI bill. Now, over the years, there have been some rumors or talks, particularly in China, about going for horizontal AI law, but these rumors have not yet really risen far into official government layers. Likewise, in the US, when the Biden administration was still in, there have been talks by several senators like Blumenthal and Hawley around having some AI Act in place, but these proposals have not been progressed ever since the new administration came in. Um, a lot of countries are in this category where they don't have an AI specific law. If you can see here, there's a good mix of countries, but I can see a lot of the common law countries are still in this category, and that's an interesting trend to take note of. Civil law systems and common law systems. A lot of civil law systems are in the horizontal AI bill approach, and that makes sense because the definition of a civil law system is that you have all your rules into codified into like a piece of paper, your one act, right? Your legislation. Whereas common law systems, they can be more flexible with their sources of law. You can have law in statutes, but you can also have law in written by not written by interpreted by the courts, and their interpretations can then be binding on lower courts. And so for common law, the case in point would be contract law, right? Contract law in common law jurisdictions is largely driven by court precedents rather than by statutes. And a lot of the AI risk, part of it is codified in the law, but a lot of it, such as business to business risk management or private entities risk management, these are still largely a feature of contract law. So hence why common law systems have more flexibility in managing AI risk through contracts. And Australia, New Zealand, India, Singapore, UK, they're in these categories. You do have some civil law countries in this case and Sharia law countries in the case. I don't see any definitive pattern for these countries being in this bucket. Is either likely because they're still trying to test the waters and trying to make sure that they don't commit to a particular approach. So you can also take this category as sort of like a wait and see bucket where these countries are still trying to experiment. How well can the private sector, the market, how well are they at voluntary self-regulation? If the market is really good at regulating itself, then it might be that hard binding regulation might not be required, or you don't need too many of these hard binding rules. Now that might seem a bit, trusting the private market too much. That could be the case in some countries, but in other countries where the private sector is actually quite responsible historically, that approach might be a viable. And this often really comes down to just a lot of factors, so like capital structure, government investment and grants, talent pool. It's really a big ecosystem question rather than a legal regulatory question. So yeah, so that's trend one. Trend number two, um, look beyond the laws and bills for the full story. Now, I know when it comes to AI regulation, people often like to follow, like for example, my tracker, right? If you look at my tracker, if you click like on a country, you can see like a summary of like, the bills and measures and regulations and frameworks. So often when I read reports, people tend to focus on these hard deliverables, but what I think in order to really understand a market, you can't just look at those hard deliverables. You also have to look at the day-to-day developments. So the stuff that happens every day. So, and the reason why it's important is I can illustrate through two graphs. So if we look at this one where we're ranking the top 10 jurisdictions in terms of who are the most active in terms of the volume of legislative, executive, and other standards and frameworks, if you look at this graph, one will think, okay, the US is number one, Australia number two, China number three, etc. So these are just ranking in terms of their hard deliverables. And just a quick side note on the US, a lot of people say that there is an AI deregulation trend in the US. I disagree. There's actually a lot of bills being proposed in the US right now. Contrary to popular belief, despite the change in administration, if you look at all the bills, there's a lot that's been proposed since the start of this year. So if I were to start from, I think it started really from here. Like, actually, yeah. Like if you look up, like we're in month 11 of this year, but look at that. There's a lot of bills that have been proposed at the federal level, and not to mention at the state level. So in particular, California, Tennessee, New York, and the like. So a lot of bills have been proposed in the US. Now, whether these bills will actually become law, that's a whole different question. But we do see a lot of bills being proposed, and also regulatory activity hasn't necessarily slowed down in the US. The FTC is still prosecuting, AI fraud and scam cases. I don't see any noticeable decline in the action. So enforcement actions are still what I'm seeing, still popping off in the US. So anyway, just a side note. But the main thing is that I want to contrast this graph with the next graph, which is AI related news activities. So here I basically gathered the top 10 markets in terms of day-to-day activities. So it could be making press statements, press releases, government official interviews. It could also be, um, inside scripts where news reports report on informal statements from ministers. So really just any statement or any sort of dialogue around AI on a day-to-day basis. I basically regard it. You can see here, again, US naturally leads number one, but you can see a reshuffling of different countries. You can see there's a lot happening in UK, EU, South Korea, China, Australia, India, Singapore, Japan, and Brazil. So if you contrast to the top above, again, very different ranking system. There's a lot of talk happening in these markets. And the main point I want to take away from this is that the ultimate question is when you're trying to follow AI regulation, what the law says is one thing, but what you really have to focus on is market practice, right? Like how is the law actually enforced and perceived and received by the market? And the only way to get a sense of that is you have to follow those day-to-day news updates. For example, South Korea has done a lot over the past few weeks, especially since the last election. If you purely looked at the acts and bills, there's only like a couple examples that you can see here, and you can see, the Basic Act, the Basic AI Act, which is really their flagship AI Act, which is already enforced, but the penalty provisions are still not yet enforced from here. But what you may not know is that actually 2 days ago, or was it 2 days ago? Let me just refresh this page. Yesterday, the ICT Ministry released a draft decree of the Basic AI Act, which proposes to delay the enforcement provisions by 1 year. So there's a grace period of 1 year. So if you did not know about that, so I think my internet connection might be a bit wobbly here. So let me just try to fix that. Let me just go to what angles are these markets looking at? And based on a keyword search across my tracker dollar, I've basically found out that privacy, cyber, and copyright are the three top enforcement angles to AI. So privacy, that's a should be a pretty obvious one because AI consumes a lot of data, it processes a lot of data, and in most cases that data can involve personal information. And actually, over the past few years, the data privacy regulator has often been the default or the sort of like the main AI enforcer um in across markets, particularly in Europe, particularly in South America, and also across Africa. So it's often the privacy regulator that's doing a lot of the heavy lifting. And then you also have the cyber regulator. Often in many jurisdictions, they have attached functions to look after cybersecurity. And that has been quite a big issue, especially since as AI systems become more behind the scenes and integrates with other environments, the security of those environments becomes very important. And especially as we move into the era of agentic AI, where agents can start just doing things for you in the background, the cybersecurity of the agents is very important. And we've seen occasional cases of cybersecurity breaches, not yet too sophisticated. Most of them are still just around the lines of authentication. So, where you know authorization tokens have been leaked or not properly secured, and these agents then have been compromised. So, pretty still basic cybersecurity incidents, but we see it getting more sophisticated in the near future, and we'll see the regulatory enforcement trying to tackle that. And also copyright. This is where we have a big difference between civil law and common law. In most common law jurisdictions, copyright is mainly so there's copyright law, but the enforcement is mainly done through private entities settled through the court system. So when there's a copyright infringement, whoever's been infringed upon will try to sue the infringer and then see if they can get an injunction or damages or whatever. So that's but a lot of the so that there's that side. But the reason why copyright has come up in the top three of regulatory focus is because a lot of papers by government, a lot of interviews, a lot of the top concerns from government officials around AI is really around copyright. How do we balance between copyright holder interests and also the interests of the AI developers who need to consume a lot of data to build up products? And we've seen a wide spectrum of approaches across the world. For example, in Australia, I think 2 weeks ago, our Australian government has officially ruled out the text slash data mine exception to our copyright law. Whereas in other countries, like in the EU, there is that sort of exception, order on a limited basis. You have the UK sort of in between the EU and Australia approach. And you also have other jurisdictions like I'd say um, maybe actually that I'm still talking from the legislative approach, but regulatory approach. You also have the US Copyright Office, which over the past year or so they've been producing a lot of papers on AI and copyright, and they've produced like a three-part series to this. There was the recent sort of sacking of the US Copyright Office director by the Trump administration early in the year. I won't get too deep into that, but there's been the copyright angle has been, to say the least, the most contentious and the most spicy angle in the AI sort of policy discourse across many countries. Hence why it's popped up a lot in the regulatory focus bit. Yeah, I'm conscious that I think that's half an hour done, so I want to keep this live stream short. Um, I I do have an API, so just a quick plug. In my tracker, there is an API function that lets you plug into the data of the tracker, and is available in both Python and Node.js, and also in Curl. And yeah, it's on a paid subscription basis to help me sort of just cover the server costs behind this. But you can play around with the data and gather your own insights based on that. With that, yeah, I think I'll probably end the live stream here. So thank you everyone for watching, and in case you missed it, hope this recording will be helpful for all. So yeah, thank you.